Sudden change without warning. There was no memo, no warning, not even the soft rumblings of office gossip that usually signal something seismic might be about to happen. That morning, as I walked through the glass doors at Triana Corp's downtown Kansas City office, the familiar routine comforted me. A quick greeting to the security guard, nod to the receptionist, the weight of my laptop bag on my shoulder. It could have been any Wednesday in my 9 years there, except for the tension hanging in the air, something nearly imperceptible but enough to make my steps just a little slower as I headed toward the conference room. Inside, the room was brighter than usual, the overhead light glinting off the polished mahogany table. I was called in 30 minutes before my typical start time. That was the first red flag. Brian Ellsworth, just 6 months into his tenure as our new VP of Sales, occupied the head of the table wearing one of his trademark tailored suits. His demeanor was polished, almost too rehearsed, every gesture calculated down to the arranging of the termination forms squared neatly in front of him. I'd always found his motivational aphorisms insincere, but today his smile was especially hollow. "Darren, thanks for coming in early," he began, his tone light, almost casual. "Corporate's moving in a more aggressive direction. We need hungrier talent who can meet higher targets. You've done great work here, but the business world is changing and we need to adapt." I didn't need him to spell it out. When he slid the stack of papers across the glossy table, the word termination was stamped in bold across the top sheet. I held my composure, hands steady as I looked him in the eye, searching for some sign of regret or even discomfort. There was none. I realized in that moment I was no longer sitting across from a colleague but an emissary for the new regime, a functionary sent to do a job removed from empathy. Though the words stung, I felt an odd calm rise in my chest. 9 years reduced to a 3-minute speech and an impersonal document. I thought about all the early mornings, late nights, cross-country flights, back-to-back meetings. None of it accounted for in this tidy, sterile process. The silence in the room was oppressive. I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak without bitterness, and gathered my things silently. The walk from the conference room back to my office was surreal. Every step echoed with a sense of dislocation, as if I were moving through someone else's life. Faces of colleagues glanced up, some offering nervous smiles, others quickly looking away. It wasn't just my tenure ending in this moment, it was the quiet breaking of a trust I'd spent nearly a decade building. As I closed my office door behind me for the last time, I allowed myself a single deep breath before the task of packing up began. No matter the reasons given or the smooth delivery, nothing prepares you for how coldly and efficiently change can come in corporate America. Even when you suspect the writing is on the wall, the finality of the act is like a sudden storm you'd hoped would pass you by. I realized then, the only thing more unforgiving than corporate ambition is how little time they give you to process that you've just become a casualty of it. Building a legacy. Looking back, I realize building a legacy is hardly ever about grand gestures or headline moments, at least it wasn't for me. My legacy at Triana didn't begin with an executive title, but with a reliable reputation and a willingness to outwork and outlast. Kansas City isn't Wall Street, but when you're trying to build trust in finance from the ground up, you have to be willing to meet clients for coffee at 6 a.m., to drive across frozen highways to keep a lunch, to know their kid's name and remember when their mother had surgery. Legacy grows in those granular details. My first desk at Triana might as well have been a folding table by the window. We were Midwestern Financial back then, just 18 people trying to carve out space in a market owned by bigger firms. Everett Stanton, our CEO, hired me because he believed personal trust was worth more than any fancy marketing campaign. "I want someone local who knows the market and is willing to go out there and listen," he said during my interview. I'd been passed over for a promotion at my last company, too persistent supposedly, too focused on client satisfaction instead of chasing every shiny new opportunity. That kind of loyalty doesn't fit every company, but at Triana, at least in the early years, it was a superpower. I spent weekends on the road visiting every corner of the Midwest. Each business I brought on board, from Lockhart Manufacturing to the first 3-year renewal with Henderson Group, represented not just numbers, but trust. Trust built through consistency and follow-up, through handling late-night calls and last-minute crises without complaint. Clients didn't sign multi-year contracts with an unknown logo, they signed because they believed in me. And as Triana grew, so did my personal stake. 3 promotions, 2 office moves, 1 brutal recession, we weathered them all together, and my portfolio swelled with every hurdle. Looking around the city, my accounts ranged from local entrepreneurs to national brands. But my proudest moments weren't about revenue lines, they were the handwritten thank you notes, the Christmas cards from clients and their families. Even when it meant missing my own family's dinners, school events, ball games, I told myself each small sacrifice was investing in something bigger. Security for Rebecca and our kids, pride in work that left a mark you could actually measure. Ironically, I had stopped thinking of my job as just a paycheck years before anyone else at Triana noticed. The real legacy wasn't the revenue, it was the network of people who knew, if I said I'd deliver, I would. That was the foundation I built. Not a monument with my name, but a culture of reliability, of relationships that outlast trends and outmaneuver corporate pivots. When Brian came in and saw only numbers, not people, he missed what made Triana's success possible in the first place. Every new sales initiative, every review meeting, every strategic pivot, they all came down to whether clients believed in the people behind the company facade. Of course, it took losing my job to see just how much of my legacy was intangible, woven into the daily lives and ordinary phone calls that make up real business. But that's the paradox of legacy. You rarely see its full shape until you're on the outside looking in, until you realize the most important thing you've built isn't a database or a quarterly report, but a trust that follows you wherever you choose to go next. Subtle signs, unspoken warnings. The truth is, warning signs never announce themselves clearly. You just start to notice the tiniest cracks in the routine you once took for granted. For me, those signs crept in quietly at Triana Corp. A corner seat moved just out of the hum of the main floor, my name vanishing from calendar invites I normally drove, and one afternoon, returning from lunch to catch IT poking around my desktop like it wasn't really mine anymore. The moment felt insignificant on the surface, yet I'd spent my life paying attention to undercurrents, a necessity in both sales and survival. It wasn't just the physical changes. Overnight, that sense of belonging I'd always felt shifted almost imperceptibly. The friendly chatter in the break room faded when I walked in. People who used to seek my advice began glancing away or giving watery smiles. Even the energy of my team felt restless, distracted, as if they, maybe even unconsciously, knew that the air was thick with something unsaid. Then came the policies. Brian's first big commission restructure cut my pay by a fifth, supposedly to motivate top performers, though my numbers had never wavered. I tried to brush it off. That's corporate life, I told myself. A game of moving targets. But the erosion was constant. Where I used to be the go-to for big decisions or new account pitches, suddenly my ideas went unacknowledged. I had fewer and fewer invitations to strategic meetings, and initiatives I'd typically spearhead were handed to new faces brought in by Brian, always eager, always disruptive. The slow exclusion stung most at unexpected moments. My expense reports got flagged for trivialities that would have been routine months before. Assistant assignments shuffled with no explanation. The weekly pipeline review became a formality. My slide deck, once the centerpiece, now barely glanced at. Each of these moments on their own was small. Together, they painted a picture you'd only recognize if you'd been through it before. I had, early in my career, and I recognized the choreography: freeze out, discredit, replace. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if I was imagining it all. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then, one afternoon as Brian swept by my desk to chat with Alicia, the newest MBA in our division, I heard him say, "We want to future-proof this team." And I realized with a hollow certainty, corporate America had a script for people like me. Celebrated for loyalty until one day, without so much as an official memo, you become obsolete. The warning signs aren't loud. They're quiet, surgical, and easy to doubt, right up until it's your turn face to face with the person sliding the termination papers across the table. Saying goodbye in silence. I packed up nearly a decade of my life into a single worn-out cardboard box, framed photos from beach vacations in Florida, the mug my daughter decorated in second grade, a battered notebook with handwritten notes from countless client meetings, and a carefully maintained folder of personal contact numbers. Each item felt weighted not just by memory, but by a quiet sense of finality. There were no goodbyes to the team, no dramatic pronouncement. I chose to keep my head down and avoid attracting attention, slipping into the background with a subtle dignity. In the middle of stacking my belongings, Valerie from accounting passed by, her brow wrinkled in confusion. "Need a hand with that? Moving offices again?" she asked, oblivious to what had really happened behind those glass walls. I managed a polite smile, not wanting her to be caught in the crossfire, or made an unwitting witness to my humiliation. "Something like that," I murmured. The truth didn't need to be spoken aloud. The gesture, the box, the empty desk, said enough. Making my way through the quiet halls, I noticed how my footsteps seemed to echo more than usual. Some colleagues stole glances over their cubicle walls, unsure whether to make eye contact or look away. The ones who usually bantered with me by the coffee machine barely nodded, perhaps unsure if it was safer to keep their distance, fearing guilt by association in a company veering toward sharp change. Silence was a universal language in moments like this. Nobody quite knew what to say, so they said nothing at all. The elevator ride to the lobby was surreal. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, clutching the box, feeling like an anonymous visitor rather than someone who had once helped shape the culture and direction of the company. The receptionist gave me a half-hearted, "Take care, Darren," and quickly averted her gaze. In that moment I felt both invisible and exposed, a paradox that stunned me more than the actual firing. Out in the parking lot, the spring air felt cooler and crisper than it had inside. The sky over Kansas City was vast and unmarred, free in a way I suddenly realized I was too. I loaded the box into my car, pausing for a quiet moment behind the wheel. They say exits are louder than arrivals, yet mine was a study in secrecy, not spectacle. My final act at Triana Corp was not a confrontation or public grievance, but a private, measured withdrawal. I had given the company my voice for 9 years, and in leaving, I reclaimed a sense of self-respect that words couldn't quite express. Without announcement, and without noise, I drove away, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the steady beat of my own heart, moving forward into uncertainty, but finally, on my own terms. Self-value reassessment. When I walked out of Triana Corp for the last time, cardboard box in hand and my 9-year story reduced to a handful of personal artifacts, it would have been easy to drown in bitterness or outrage. Surprisingly, it was clarity, not resentment, that washed over me. That feeling didn't come from a place of denial, it came from somewhere deeper, some long-buried intuition that finally had room to breathe after years of being crowded out by sales quotas, performance reviews, and relentless deals. Driving home in the spring dusk, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at me. I had built my sense of achievement for nearly a decade on titles, reputation, the approving nods from bosses like Everett Stanton. Yet the abruptness of my exit forced a different calculus. If all it took for everything I'd made at Triana to evaporate was a stack of termination papers and a corporate reorganization, then what were my achievements really worth? Did my value reside in sales figures and market share, or did it exist in something less tangible, but infinitely more resilient? For the first time in years, the mental noise quieted. I remembered my early days, the pride I felt not because my report was flawless, but because a client smiled and said, "I trust you." I remembered promises kept and crises managed well past midnight, small gestures of integrity that left an imprint, even if they went unseen by management. Those moments of trust and follow-through formed the core of my work identity, one that no pink slip could actually erase. There was relief in realizing I didn't need Everett's approval or Brian's validation for my sense of agency. Their oversight had kept me in their orbit, but outside those walls I was still the sum of years of discipline, empathy, and persistence. The layoff forced me to step back and scrutinize the true foundation of my self-worth. It dawned on me that the best parts of my career, the parts that mattered, came from how I connected with people, how I steadied teams in difficult quarters, and how I honored commitments, even when it was inconvenient. By the time I reached the driveway, my resentment had faded. In its place was a complex sense of gratitude, for the lessons, the failures, even for the pain of being forced out. Corporate recognition is fleeting, but integrity, relationships, and resilience are lasting currencies. I understood now, perhaps for the first time, that my value would travel with me, to wherever I went next, and maybe, just maybe, it would mean more now than it ever did within the confines of a corporate identity. Faces that remain. I still remember the exact faces of those I left behind, even as the echo of my own departure faded. The office had always been more than just cubicles and conference calls. It was a series of human stories, each running parallel, sometimes intersecting, sometimes diverging. After I left Triana, the ones who stayed on became both a haunting memory and a curious focus of my nightly thoughts. Walking through those halls one last time, I'd glimpsed the worry and the relief etched on my colleagues' faces. For people like Valerie in accounting, the news of my exit barely registered as a blip. She had payroll spreadsheets and deadlines to chase, and I was just another cell in her weekly report soon to be archived. But for others, the empty desk became a silent warning, a station suddenly vacant, the absence ringing louder than any formal announcement. My closest teammates, from veterans I'd coached through quarterly fire drills to the fresh recruits who absorbed every account pitch like scripture, wore their worry differently. I caught Jamie's trembling attempt at a reassuring smile, and the subtle shift in Marcus's body language as he hunched deeper over his monitor. In those final moments I felt an odd responsibility, not to say too much or too little, to leave them with hope rather than heaviness. Part of me wanted to tell them, "You're next," but I bit it back. No one wants to imagine their own redundancy. Even away from the office, the faces of those who remained surfaced in my mind's eye as the days ticked by. Was Leah still triple-checking every client folder, hoping to evade the next performance review ambush? Did Eric, once eager and boisterous, draw back into cautious silence as corporate winds shifted unpredictably? The bonds forged over years, inside jokes, after-work trivia nights, the mutual griping over new policies, felt amputated, leaving phantom pains that flared up in the quiet of early mornings. The harshest truth was that for all our camaraderie, the rhythm of the office didn't pause for any single loss. By the next Monday my presence wasn't just missing, it had been paved over. Legacy emails routed elsewhere, my chair quietly reassigned, desk recirculated, achievements erased off sales boards. But for the remaining faces, something always lingered, a subtle nervousness in team meetings, guarded answers, a little more self-preservation behind each interaction. Every exit like mine writes itself into the story of those left behind. Would they remember how quickly trust could evaporate and put up their own defenses? Or would the friendships we built survive in displaced lunch meetups or stray texts, solidarity blooming quietly where corporate policy might frown on it? I wondered often if Jamie or Marcus ever glanced at my old seat and wondered, will I be next? Maybe that's the cruelest part of corporate survival, not the departures but the scars of uncertainty that only deepen as every friendly face becomes a mirror for your own future. The faces that stayed behind became reminders of what I'd given, what I'd lost, and the tenuous nature of belonging that haunts office life long after your badge stops working at the door. Memories and new motivation. On the first evening after my departure I sat in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the residual hum of a routine that no longer belonged to me. The house, usually filled with hurried footsteps, phone calls, and late-night report printouts, now seemed painfully silent. I found myself sifting through old emails, photos, and notes, snapshots of moments when my existence had revolved around Triana Corp. Yet, as each memory resurfaced, so did a series of poignant realizations. I flashed back to Rebecca, my wife, teasing me over cold dinners gone untouched, the kids' school plays with one empty seat in the auditorium, the birthday candles lit after midnight. For years I justified my absence by convincing myself it was all for their future, a sacrifice repaid with college funds, carefree vacations, and a house we could call our own. But now, standing at the crossroads of the past and future, those rationalizations felt both weighty and hollow. Gradually, as the images of missed moments passed before me, a new perspective began to take shape. The most meaningful rewards from those years weren't the bonus checks or the corporate awards gathering dust on my bookshelf. It was the trust I had built, with clients who called just to check in, with colleagues who confided in me during tense quarters, with my family who waited, even without complaint. I realized that the true legacy I left behind was not confined to quarterly results or job titles, but was embedded in relationships and the quiet gratitude that comes from doing the right things for the right reasons. That night, fueled by a mix of nostalgia and an unfamiliar restlessness, I began jotting down what I wanted next, not just out of a career, but out of life itself. I asked myself if I could no longer measure my worth by annual revenue growth, what would my new metric be? A better father and husband, a more present friend, or perhaps simply a leader who inspires loyalty not by position but by example. Stumbling blocks and new opportunities. The days immediately following my abrupt departure from Triana Corp were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and a sobering sense of unfamiliar freedom. For the first time in nearly a decade, there was no barrage of emails waiting for my response at dawn, no calendar reminders pinging with urgent meetings, and no nervous anticipation of quarterly goals. There was just a blank calendar, and in its own way, that emptiness felt as daunting as the uncertainty itself. At first, the void was filled by anxiety. Every morning I found myself waking up at the old hour, muscle memory propelling me through routines that suddenly had no real endpoint. Dress shirt, black coffee, scanning through news headlines like I was still searching for market shifts. Unemployment, even when expected, comes with a peculiar inertia. Questions circled my mind. Was I too old to start over? Had I invested too much of myself in one company, making me invisible now that I was out of the game? In the midst of this identity crisis, a surprising opportunity surfaced. While reviewing my exit paperwork, I noticed a technicality in my non-compete clause. It only applied if I had quit voluntarily. In my case, the severance agreement meant I was free to seek positions even with direct competitors. The realization struck with the force of a fresh breeze. I was not as powerless as I initially thought. That spark of possibility began to erode my anxieties, making room for cautious optimism. Around the same time, longtime clients began reaching out. Some were genuinely concerned, others just curious about office rumors, but many admitted their loyalty was to the person, not the logo. More than once I heard, "Wherever you go, I want to work with you." That refrain rekindled my sense of purpose and reminded me that professional worth isn't just measured by tenure or title, but also by relationships forged over years of steady trust. As word of my availability quietly made the rounds in industry circles, a rival firm, Grantley & Company, contacted me for an informal lunch. I walked into their downtown office with none of the baggage of my old role, braced for a hard sell, but instead was greeted by candid questions about vision and values. Unlike Triana, Grantley offered agency and acknowledged the value in client relationships built on consistency, not just bottom lines. Their offer was bold, a senior executive role with the freedom to bring my own book of business, and the sort of trust that had always mattered most to me. Choosing to accept, not just the job, but the end of an era and the start of a new one, required shedding some leftover bitterness. I came to see my ouster not as a defeat, but as a catalyst for growth. The stumble had exposed structural cracks I'd overlooked in my own self-assessment, but it also spotlighted the strengths I'd spent years cultivating. With each phone call from former clients and every brainstorming session with my new colleagues, I rediscovered the ambition and belief I once brought to my earliest days in finance. It was as if I'd been handed both a clean slate and the benefit of hard-won wisdom, ready to embrace opportunity from the embers of my setback. Underlying currents within the company. If I've learned anything from nearly a decade in corporate America, it's that genuine turmoil seldom announces itself with fanfare. It brews patiently in the fissures between official memos, in private huddles by the break room, and in whispered pauses between elevator chimes. After my abrupt exit, I started piecing together the overlooked clues that hinted at deeper unrest inside Triana Corp. My departure was just the spark. The kindling had been gathering for months. Within mere days, the ripple effects were undeniable. Colleagues who used to loop me into decision chains suddenly flooded my phone with cryptic check-ins. Some were nervous about their own standing. "Have you heard anything else? Was it just you?" While others, still clinging to optimism, framed it as just a transition. But in corporate ecosystems, such politeness rarely survives contact with a full-blown shakeup. I soon realized my own story was unfolding in parallel with others. Valerie from accounting confided in hushed tones about her department's budget being slashed, while Jamie on the sales team whispered of sudden audits and unannounced performance reviews creeping further down the pecking order. What struck me most was the shift in the company's energy. Meetings became increasingly formal, with managers parroting corporate talking points as if reading from newly issued scripts. Shared jokes vanished beneath a layer of polite surveillance. You could almost taste the anxiety lingering above every team check-in. It was as if, with my departure, so swift, so quiet, management had signaled open season on anyone perceived as too loyal to the old guard or too hesitant to embrace Brian's aggressive new agenda. In the weeks that followed, I heard from a handful of trusted friends at Triana about bizarre procedural changes, sudden reshuffling of project leads, arbitrary cuts to travel budgets, and long-standing employee privileges revoked with a curt all-staff email. People started packing up desks discreetly, carrying boxes out late in the evening. The company cafeteria, once noisy with cross-department catch-ups, devolved into a quiet warren of isolated tables and nervous glances. For those attuned to internal politics, it became clear that these weren't just teething pains from a leadership change. The executive floor buzzed with rumors of an impending acquisition, persistent enough to seep into the nervous chatter between IT techs and mid-level managers. The more conversations I had with ex-colleagues, the clearer the pattern. Rapid consolidation of power, public scapegoating, and the thinning out of long-tenured staff who'd embodied Triana's culture before Brian. Those with business relationships that mirrored mine either fled for safer ground or faced thinly veiled pressure campaigns to reassess their fit for the company's future. Beneath it all, there was a pervading sense of betrayal, not just felt by me but by everyone who'd invested years believing Triana was more than numbers. In that disillusionment, I could see my own experience refracted back at me, multiplied by the uncertainty gripping the broader organization. If I was the canary, then the rest of the workforce had started bracing for the fallout still to come, silent, vigilant, and increasingly united by the understanding that sometimes the real dangers in corporate life are the ones that hide beneath the surface, only to erupt when you least expect it. The truth revealed. The truth didn't announce itself with a single email or conference room showdown. It slowly unraveled through whispered conversations and accidental slips, pieced together like a corporate detective novel. In the weeks that followed my dismissal, seemingly disconnected fragments began to line up. First came the sudden churn in upper management, then rumors of confidential meetings between executives who had previously avoided each other in the hallways. Old colleagues pinged me after hours, anxious for any clarity, their texts cryptic but urgent. "Did you hear anything about an acquisition? Why are so many client meetings going directly to Brian now?" As my perspective shifted from insider to outsider, I was able to spot patterns I'd once been too close, or perhaps too loyal, to see. It became clear that my firing wasn't just about change management or a new sales strategy. The layoffs weren't random culls of underperformance but a targeted move to remove anyone considered too close to the legacy of Triana's founding values. Embedded in every department, these people were more than just high earners. They were keepers of intangible trust, the old guard who held relationships with core clients. I began to see the outlines of a larger design, one that reached far beyond my individual experience. Then, in a moment of clarity, a former inside contact inadvertently let slip the plan. Triana Corp was being positioned for a quiet buyout. The new leadership's entire playbook, purging key staff, fast-tracking newer, more pliable hires, redirecting client relationships, was a condition required by a potential buyer, a private equity firm rumored to be Veritas Capital. Their terms apparently demanded not just impressive balance sheets but also clean client lists that could transfer seamlessly to new management. In this context, my stubborn detachment from brand-first sales and the fierce loyalty of my client base became obstacles to an effortless handover. I was no longer just a cost center, I was a deal-breaker. It explained the eerie politeness in my exit, the lack of confrontation, and the almost clinical speed of my removal. Once my relationships were seen as a wild card, I was simply excised from the process. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the qualities once hyped by the old leadership were now liabilities in the transactional logic of acquisition. The real twist? In the turbulent aftermath, word spread quickly that several legacy clients had refused to transition. Most made personal calls to check in, a handful even expressing plans to walk if their lead contact at Grantley & Company wasn't me. The supposed seamless transition turned out to be anything but. The proposed deal with Veritas started to fray at the edges, as the true value of loyalty and trust couldn't be reduced to a line item in a spreadsheet. My dismissal, engineered as a step toward a lucrative buyout, had inadvertently undermined the very certainty the acquirer required. When the Veritas deal fell apart, the news reached me from 3 separate sources before it ever landed in the industry papers. I was struck by a complicated mix of triumph and melancholy. I wasn't out to sabotage anyone, but I knew in my gut that culture, commitment, and genuine relationships aren't easily replaced or commoditized, no matter how meticulous the M&A checklist. In the end, the biggest secret wasn't just that the company was for sale or that my firing had been preordained. The secret was that the heart of any business can't just be negotiated away in a deal memo. The very thing the new regime tried to cut out was the thing they could never truly control. Triumph born from adversity. Success, in my experience, rarely arrives in the neat upward trajectory celebrated in self-help books or LinkedIn homilies. If anything, it's forged in the crucible of setbacks and the heavy, humbling weight of starting over. Less than half a year after my abrupt dismissal, my career had transformed in ways I could never have scripted from behind my old Triana Corp. desk. The first true validation came as the months rolled forward. Familiar names began reappearing on my phone screen, loyal clients, many of whom had shared only cautious handshakes and polite emails when I started fielding their business years ago. Now, free of my old logo but not my reputation, I realized just how deep the currents of trust had run all along. Conversations that started with, "We heard what happened," turned into, "How can we transfer our portfolio to you?" A relationship anchored in reliability could weather any brand storm. Within 6 months, over $8 million in new revenue flowed through Grantley, and with it, a surge of renewed belief in myself and my approach. What surprised me most about this growth wasn't the numbers themselves, but the unmistakable sense that my value had always stemmed from something personal and intangible, a willingness to invest in each client as a partner, not just a quarterly figure. I was invited to speak at an industry conference, a first in my career, and as I shared hard-earned lessons about authenticity, long-game thinking, and the real roots of client loyalty, I watched nods spread through an audience peppered with faces from rival firms and former competitors. My own story had become proof that a business built on genuine relationships can thrive, even after a reputational earthquake. What happened at Triana did more than shake my confidence. It changed my entire philosophy as a leader. At Grantley, I had the agency to hire, mentor, and foster the kind of culture I'd always believed in, but had never fully managed to establish at my previous company. My team wasn't just a collection of resumes. They were individuals whose strengths and stories I learned with intent, making sure that nobody ever felt as invisible as I did during my final days at Triana. Meanwhile, Triana's trajectory became a sobering backdrop. News trickled across the industry grapevine, rapid expansion plans unraveled, management's attempts at dramatic cultural overhaul, leading to a stream of public resignations and underwhelming financial quarters. Brian, the executive who delivered my termination speech without a flicker of remorse, was quietly let go less than a year after my departure. The irony wasn't lost on me. Systems that focus solely on the next big number, ignoring the roots of relationship-driven success, rarely outlast their short bursts of progress. Yet I didn't revel in their missteps. If anything, the setbacks at Triana only confirmed the beliefs that now formed my own managerial compass. Watching a once proud company falter didn't bring satisfaction, just a somber sense of vindication. When integrity gives way to short-term ambition, even the most aggressively ambitious plans can fizzle. The lesson wasn't just for them, it was inscribed on my own future approach to leadership, ensuring that old wounds wouldn't repeat in my new chapter. With each milestone Grantley achieved, whether it was signing a marquee account, celebrating the first major promotion of a former Triana colleague who'd taken a chance to join my team, or simply seeing the trust rebuild between clients and staff, I understood the real victory wasn't in outpacing my previous employer. It was in restoring a space where hard work, transparency, and individual recognition weren't just buzzwords, but the foundation of every team meeting and deal signed. Public accolades followed, write-ups in trade journals, invitations to mentor rising talent, even direct calls from industry peers who once viewed me solely as competition. Their questions weren't about how to engineer a power play, but how to withstand and grow through unpredictable change. My story had become not a tale of being wronged, but of how rising from hardship with your ethics and humanity intact can ripple out far beyond the confines of your own career. Perhaps the truest measure of success from adversity wasn't external at all. Late at night, reflecting over black coffee or in rare quiet moments with Rebecca and the kids, I found that what I valued most wasn't a single contract or corporate milestone, but the confidence that no matter how turbulent circumstances became, my compass remained true. By facing and overcoming an unexpected loss, I'd discovered a kind of resilience, one that would serve as the bedrock for every challenge moving forward. Success had changed shape. It was no longer just about numbers, job titles, or even redemption in the eyes of the market. Now it meant leading by example, cultivating trust that survived corporate earthquakes, and honoring the promise to never compromise on people for the sake of progress. In the end, triumph born from adversity wasn't about winning over old rivals, it was about learning from every setback and building something lasting not just for myself, but for every partner, colleague, and client who chose to believe in a better way. Redefining the meaning of success. A year after leaving Triana, as life settled into a new cadence, I found myself confronting not just career shifts, but a deeper, more personal evaluation of what success actually meant to me. The drive to rebuild, a drive that propelled me through new client meetings, late-night strategy sessions with my new team at Grantley, and the slow, delicate process of restoring trust with both colleagues and family, revealed unresolved questions beneath the surface. What had I actually been chasing all those years, and was it really worth the sacrifices? In the quiet moments, away from deal-making and performance metrics, I started untangling the old assumptions I'd carried for so long. For nearly a decade, professional victories had been my anchor. Titles, recognition, quarterly targets hit, all markers of success in an industry that measures worth by the numbers you tally and the clients you win. But stripped of corporate banners and external validation, I had to decide for myself what counted in the long run. What legacy would endure, not in a press release, but in the real lives I'd influenced, starting with my own family. Rebecca, my wife, often became the quiet voice of reason in late-night conversations at the kitchen table. One spring evening, as I sorted through old notebooks overflowing with client lists and account plans, she asked me a simple question. "Are you proud or just relieved to be busy again?" The query was gentle, but it cut to the core. For the first time, I wasn't certain. Was my new pattern simply a repackaged version of the old rat race, or had I actually changed? That question rewired something fundamental. Instead of jumping at every opportunity for more responsibility, I began drawing boundaries, a word previously foreign to my professional vocabulary. Dinner became sacred, and weekends were rarely interrupted by work emails. I checked in on friends outside my network and found myself mentoring young staff for the pure satisfaction of seeing their confidence bloom, not just because it added to my own resume. The pleasure of achievement shifted from the numbers alone to the quality of relationships and the integrity I brought to each decision. Redefining success also meant going back to why I entered this field in the first place. To provide for my family, yes, but also to feel useful and respected, to live by a code where my word mattered. I realized my legacy wouldn't be the size of my portfolio, but the trust and guidance I offered those who sought my help, industry peers, friends, my own children as they watched me handle adversity. Some days, my urge to compete flared, and I worried I'd lose my edge. But then Rebecca would remind me with a wink of the handwritten quote she'd placed on my desk. "The best revenge is massive success, on your own terms." That became my new standard. I wanted to achieve not what others set for me, but what felt true to the life I wanted to live. Balanced, principled, generous. In this new chapter, I mentored my team at Grantley with an emphasis on recognizing everyone's contributions, not just chasing rankings. I advocated for flexibility and real dialogue, shaping company culture as much as sales performance. On the home front, I was more present, helping with school projects, making time for family hikes, and letting my children see firsthand that setbacks aren't just to be feared, but can reshape you for the better. Redefining my values didn't erase the disappointments or losses, but slowly, it helped transform them into fuel for something more meaningful. True success, I now believed, was building a life that honored not just ambition but gratitude, humility, and lasting connections. The numbers might always fluctuate, clients and positions come and go, but the values I chose to live by would be the uncompromising constant, guiding every chapter moving forward.